There are moments in history when time itself seems to stop, when the rhythm of progress falters and the world, for a breathless moment, forgets how to move forward. In 1929, the music stopped. The machines went silent. The laughter of the Roaring Twenties, the jazz, the optimism, the boundless belief in endless growth, all vanished, replaced by a sound few would ever forget: the sound of silence. Factories closed, banks collapsed, families broke apart under the weight of uncertainty. In the span of weeks, fortunes disappeared, and a nation built on confidence discovered how fragile confidence could be. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Farmers watched the earth turn to dust. Children learned to grow up faster than they should. And for the first time, the American dream seemed like exactly that: a dream. But this isn't a story only about despair. It's about resilience. It's about a generation that faced the unimaginable and refused to give up. They endured the hunger, the fear, the endless days of waiting for hope to return. And in doing so, they forged a strength the world had never seen before. They didn't just survive the Great Depression. They redefined what survival meant. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll journey through that decade of dust and determination. From the stock market crash to the New Deal, from the Dust Bowl to the battlefields of World War II, from ruin to rebirth. We'll meet the men and women who rebuilt their lives brick by brick, dollar by dollar, dream by dream. We'll uncover how the lessons of that era still shape our world today. Our markets, our governments, our fears, our hopes. Because the Great Depression was more than an economic disaster. It was a test of endurance, of faith, of humanity itself, and the story of how the world broke, and how it found the strength to begin again, is one we can never afford to forget. Music swells. A faint echo of FDR's voice blends into the score. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This is the story of the Great Depression, the decade when the world fell and learned how to rise again. The stock market crash did not immediately cause the Great Depression. It triggered it, like a spark hitting dry grass. The deeper problem was the banking system. Throughout the 1920s, thousands of banks operated with almost no federal oversight. Many were small, local institutions that lent money to farmers, shop owners, and families. And many of these banks invested depositor money directly into the stock market. So, when the market fell, banks followed. In late 1929 and early 1930, a wave of quiet withdrawals began. People were nervous. They wanted to protect what little money they had left. And in an era without deposit insurance, they had good reason to be afraid. A bank could fail at any time, and if it did, your money was simply gone. Then came the first major bank run. It started with rumors, a whisper that a certain bank was in trouble. Customers rushed to withdraw their savings. The sight of a line outside the building caused even more panic. Soon, people who had never considered withdrawing their money suddenly felt compelled to act. A self-fulfilling cycle was underway. Banks collapse because people panic. People panic because banks collapse. By the end of 1930, over 1,300 banks had failed, but the real disaster was still ahead. The failure of policy. During this critical period, the U.S. government made decisions that, unintentionally, made the crisis worse. President Herbert Hoover believed deeply in limited government and voluntary cooperation. He thought the economy would correct itself if businesses and citizens remained confident. So, when panic spread, Hoover's administration held back. They feared that direct government aid would undermine American values of self-reliance. But the crisis was too large for optimism alone. As banks failed, money disappeared from the economy. When money disappeared, spending slowed. When spending slowed, businesses closed. When businesses closed, millions lost their jobs. Economists call this a deflationary spiral. For ordinary people, it felt like a trap with no escape. Deflation, the silent enemy. Prices began to fall, not slowly but rapidly. At first, this might sound like a good thing. Cheaper goods, right? But falling prices can destroy an economy. Businesses earn less revenue. Farmers receive less for their crops. Workers are paid less, if they're paid at all. And while prices fell, debt did not. Imagine earning less money each month while your mortgage, farm loan, or business loan stays exactly the same. Debt becomes heavier, harder to repay, and eventually impossible. That is what millions of Americans faced. Families cut every expense they could. Newspapers documented heartbreaking stories of parents skipping meals to feed their children. Children quit school to find work, often unsuccessfully. The country was freezing economically. A nation built on motion had come to a standstill. The human cost, unemployment, explodes. By 1931, unemployment had surged to an unimaginable level. Town after town saw factories shuttered, mines closed, and offices emptied. Workers who had once felt secure were suddenly adrift. Men who had supported families their entire lives found themselves waiting in long lines for a bowl of soup. Some cities were hit harder than others. Detroit, the proud home of the automotive industry, saw its unemployment rate exceed 50%. Entire districts fell into silence as assembly lines stopped moving. In rural America, farmers faced a different nightmare. Crop prices collapsed. Wheat, corn, and cotton sold for less than the cost of producing them. Farmers went bankrupt and lost their land, the land many had worked for generations. A new term entered the national vocabulary: Hoovervilles. Homeless families built makeshift communities from cardboard, scrap wood, and metal. These settlements appeared in every large city, symbols of a government that many felt had abandoned them. But as bleak as things were, the worst was yet to come. The global chain reaction. The Great Depression did not stay within American borders. It spread across the world because the global economy was tightly interconnected. After World War I, many European countries owed large debts to the United States. They needed American loans to stabilize their currencies and rebuild their economies. But when U.S. banks collapsed, those loans stopped. Countries that had barely recovered from war found themselves sinking again. Germany, already burdened by reparations, saw its economy collapse. Britain abandoned the gold standard. International trade fell by 2/3. A stunning collapse that reshaped global politics. Then came the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the United States, a massive increase in import taxes. It was meant to protect American jobs, but it had the opposite effect. Other nations retaliated. Trade wars erupted. Exports plunged. Farmers suffered even more. The world economy was imploding in on itself. The loss of hope. By 1932, the Depression had become a national trauma. Families wandered the country looking for work. Trains carried thousands of unemployed men who rode the rails, searching for any opportunity. Parents wondered if they would ever regain stability. Banks that had stood for decades vanished in a single week. The sense of uncertainty was overwhelming. And then, in the middle of this despair, a new voice emerged, promising hope, action, and a new direction. But that story begins in the next chapter. A New Voice in a Broken Nation. By early 1933, the United States was in its deepest crisis since the Civil War. Almost 1 in 4 Americans had no job. Banks failed every week. Farms were collapsing. Families were hungry, cold, and exhausted. And perhaps most dangerous of all, people were losing faith in the future. Into this darkness stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was not just a politician, he was a symbol of possibility. A man who spoke not with cold statistics, but with warmth, confidence, and clarity. Where others saw chaos, Roosevelt projected calm. Where others hesitated, he promised bold action. During his inauguration on March 4, 1933, he delivered one of the most famous lines in American history. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." In that moment, many Americans felt something they had not felt in years: hope. But optimism alone couldn't fix a broken economy. What came next was one of the most aggressive transformations of government in American history. The banking emergency, restoring trust. Roosevelt's first challenge was the banking collapse. When he took office, almost every bank in America was closed, not by policy, but by panic. People no longer trusted the system, so they withdrew cash and hid it at home. Roosevelt understood that without functioning banks, nothing else could recover. One day after taking office, he declared a national bank holiday, temporarily closing every bank in the country. This might seem counterintuitive. Why close banks when people need access to money? But Roosevelt had a plan. During the closure, every bank was inspected. Healthy banks could reopen. Weak banks were reorganized. Fraudulent banks were shut down forever. Then, Roosevelt addressed the nation directly through the radio, in his first fireside chat. Speaking in a calm, conversational tone, he explained banking in simple language, reassured the public, and asked citizens to trust the system again. And they did. When banks reopened, people brought their money back. Deposits exceeded withdrawals. A wave of relief swept across the country. Confidence, the missing ingredient, was returning. The New Deal, a new kind of government. Roosevelt launched an unprecedented series of programs now known as the New Deal, an all-out effort to stabilize the economy and relieve suffering. But the New Deal wasn't one program. It was dozens, each targeting a different part of the crisis. Guaranteed bank deposits and ensured that no one would lose their money if a bank failed. The New Deal didn't end the Depression on its own, but it dramatically eased suffering and rebuilt the foundations of the modern economy. For the first time, millions of Americans felt like the government was actively fighting for them. But not everything could be fixed by policy, especially not what was coming next. The Dust Bowl, America turns to dust. While cities struggled with unemployment, rural America faced a completely different kind of catastrophe, one caused not by markets, but by nature, or, more accurately, by a combination of nature and human choices. During the early 1930s, a massive drought hit the Great Plains, stretching from Texas to Nebraska. Rain stopped, soil hardened, temperatures soared. Farmers had plowed millions of acres of grassland during the boom years, believing the good times would never end. But the native grasses they removed had protected the soil for thousands of years. Without them, the land was exposed. When the wind came, it didn't just blow gently across the plains, it tore the earth apart. Dust storms, towering black walls of soil, swept across the region. Homes were buried, crops vanished, animals suffocated, children developed dust pneumonia. Some storms were so large that they darkened cities 1,000 miles away. New York found dust on its windowsills. Ships at sea reported soil falling from the sky. Farmers who had survived low crop prices now faced a deeper crisis. Their land, their livelihood, was turning into desert. Tens of thousands of families packed what little they owned and fled west, hoping to find work in California. They became known as Okies, regardless of whether they came from Oklahoma. Many found only poverty, discrimination, and overcrowded labor camps. The Dust Bowl was not just an environmental disaster. It was a human tragedy layered on top of economic suffering. The national mood, struggle and survival. Despite the New Deal, life in the mid-1930s was still incredibly difficult. People adapted in creative ways. Families shared homes with relatives. Communities formed co-ops to share resources. Neighbors cooked large pots of food together. Small towns held dances and gatherings to lift spirits. People repaired everything, clothes, tools, shoes, because replacing them wasn't an option. But even with resilience, hardship remained. Children grew up faster than they should have. Parents carried guilt they couldn't express. Young adults postponed dreams of college, travel, or marriage. The Depression reshaped an entire generation, not through the ruin it caused, but through the resourcefulness it demanded. The limits of the New Deal. Not everyone was satisfied. By the mid-1930s, Roosevelt had become one of the most popular presidents in American history. But popularity didn't mean universal support. In fact, the New Deal faced heavy criticism from both the left and the right. Some argued the New Deal didn't go far enough. Others claimed it went too far. On one side were conservatives, business leaders, and some members of Congress who believed government was becoming too powerful. They feared the New Deal would destroy free markets and turn America towards socialism. They opposed programs like the WPA, the AAA, and new federal regulations. On the other side were populist figures who said Roosevelt wasn't doing nearly enough to fight poverty and inequality. Three major critics stood out: 1. Huey Long, Share Our Wealth. A charismatic, controversial senator from Louisiana. He proposed heavy taxes on the rich and guaranteed income for every family. His message, the New Deal is not bold, it's timid. Some believed he could have challenged Roosevelt for the presidency if he hadn't been assassinated in 1935. 2. Father Charles Coughlin. The radio priest, one of the most influential radio broadcasters in America. He blended religion, politics, and emotional speeches. Over time, he drifted into conspiracy theories and extremism, ultimately losing mainstream support. 3. Dr. Francis Townsend. A physician who proposed generous pensions for the elderly. His ideas directly pressured Roosevelt into creating Social Security. The tension between Roosevelt and these voices showed a critical truth. In times of crisis, people search for powerful leaders and powerful promises. The Supreme Court versus the New Deal. Roosevelt's programs weren't just challenged politically, they were challenged legally. The Supreme Court struck down several early New Deal programs, claiming they exceeded federal power. This infuriated Roosevelt, who believed the country was facing an emergency that required bold action. In 1937, he made a controversial proposal. He wanted to expand the Supreme Court by adding new justices, a move critics called court packing. Roosevelt argued it was necessary to protect his reforms. Opponents claimed it would undermine the independence of the judiciary. Ultimately, the plan failed, but the battle had an unexpected effect. Shortly after the conflict began, the court's decisions shifted. New Deal programs started being upheld rather than struck down. Some historians call this moment the switch in time that saved 9. The 1937 recession, a depression within the depression. By 1936, the economy had improved. Unemployment dropped, production increased, confidence was returning. Some believed the worst was over, but in 1937, the recovery collapsed. A combination of factors triggered what is now known as the Roosevelt recession. The government reduced spending too early. The Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy. Businesses, still cautious, cut back on hiring. Consumers remained uncertain about the future. Factories slowed. Investments fell. Unemployment rose again, sharply. The nation feared slipping back into the darkest days of 1932. Though the downturn didn't last as long as the early Depression, it was a blunt reminder the economy was still fragile. Success could vanish overnight. Roosevelt responded by increasing spending once again. But the moment exposed the limits of economic recovery through government programs alone. The Depression was stubborn. It resisted simple solutions. And the world itself was changing rapidly in ways that would soon reshape the American economy. The global shadow. The world moves toward war. While the United States struggled to rebuild, other parts of the world spiraled into turmoil. Economic chaos didn't just create poverty, it created political extremism. Germany, devastated by hyperinflation, unemployment, and humiliation after World War I, turned to Adolf Hitler. Italy embraced Mussolini. Japan expanded aggressively across Asia. Spain plunged into civil war. The Great Depression was global, and its effects weakened democracies everywhere. Desperate populations looked for leaders who promised strength, order, and revival, no matter the cost. The rise of militaristic regimes created tension and instability across continents. America watched cautiously from a distance. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with another foreign conflict. The trauma of World War I was still fresh. Congress passed neutrality laws meant to keep the United States out of overseas wars. But the storm outside grew darker every year. The economy and the approach of World War II. Throughout the late 1930s, defense spending began to increase, not dramatically, but steadily. Factories that had been idle began receiving orders for steel machinery vehicles, aircraft components. The effect was subtle at first, but unmistakable. When Europe plunged into war in 1939, demands on American industry intensified. The U.S. was not fighting yet, but it was becoming the arsenal of democracy, supplying materials to allies like the United Kingdom. Production increased, employment rose, factories expanded. The Depression had weakened the world. Now the world's conflict was beginning to strengthen America's economy. But the true turning point was still to come, a moment that would drag the United States fully into global war and finally, decisively, end the Great Depression. The shock that changed everything. Pearl Harbor and the war economy. A world on the edge. In the final years of the 1930s, the world was unsteady, teetering between fragile peace and global war. Europe was burning. Hitler's armies marched across the continent. In Asia, Japan had invaded China, seizing resources and territory. And yet, across the ocean, America still watched from the sidelines, cautious, weary, unwilling to be drawn in. The memories of the Great War and the Great Depression were still too raw. Most Americans wanted security, not sacrifice. Factories were still recovering from the economic collapse. Jobs were returning, but uncertainty lingered like a fog over every town. The world was moving toward conflict, but the United States was still healing. That would change in one morning. The morning of December 7th, 1941. It was a Sunday like any other in Hawaii. Bright sun, calm seas, and quiet routine. Sailors were preparing for breakfast. Families were writing letters home. Then, at 7:48 a.m., the sky roared. Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor, diving toward the anchored Pacific Fleet. Explosions shook the harbor. Battleships erupted in fire and smoke. Men ran to stations barefoot, still half asleep. Within minutes, the USS Arizona exploded in a blast so violent that it lifted the ship out of the water. By the time the attack ended, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, 1,000 more wounded, and nearly every battleship destroyed or damaged. Radio broadcasts carried the first reports to the mainland. The nation listened in stunned silence. Isolationism died that morning. President Roosevelt addressed the nation the next day. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war within hours. The Great Depression, already fading, was now over in every practical sense. America had a mission again. From uncertainty to purpose. The attack unified a nation that had been fractured for over a decade. The divisions of the Depression, between rich and poor, rural and urban, employed and jobless, melted away under the banner of survival. People who once felt powerless found purpose. Factories that had stood idle were retooled almost overnight. Men enlisted in droves. Women signed up for nursing, clerical work, and eventually industrial jobs. The war gave Americans something the Depression had stolen: direction. Every hammer swing, every shovel of coal, every sheet of steel carried meaning again. It was no longer about profit. It was about victory. Mobilization. The arsenal of democracy. The transformation was unprecedented. The United States converted its entire industrial base in record time. Car manufacturers like Ford and Chrysler began producing tanks and aircraft. General Electric shifted to radar and communications. Shipyards on both coasts expanded day and night, launching Liberty ships faster than ever before. New government agencies, the War Production Board, Office of Price Administration, and Office of War Mobilization, coordinated this industrial miracle. Factories ran 24 hours a day, with 3 full shifts of workers. Cities glowed at night under the light of production. In 1939, the U.S. had ranked 19th in military power. By 1945, it was producing more weapons than all Axis nations combined. This was not just war, it was economic resurrection. Women and the workforce, a revolution in overalls. As millions of men joined the military, industries faced an unprecedented labor shortage. The solution came from a workforce that had been largely overlooked: women. More than 6 million women entered the workforce during the war, many for the first time. They built bombers, welded ships, and assembled rifles. They wore uniforms, bandanas, and determination. The image of Rosie the Riveter captured this transformation: confident, strong, and capable. Factories that had never hired women before now depended on them. For many, this was more than a job. It was liberation. It changed how women saw themselves and how society saw them. When the war ended, many were expected to return home, but their sense of identity had permanently evolved. The Depression had trapped families in dependence. The war opened doors to possibility, rationing, resilience, and the spirit of sacrifice. Economic revival did not mean easy living. With resources diverted to war, shortages became part of daily life. Every American family received ration books filled with coupons for sugar, butter, gasoline, coffee, and even shoes. People planned meals around what they were allowed, not what they desired. But after the hunger of the 1930s, Americans knew how to make do. They grew victory gardens, producing millions of tons of fruits and vegetables. Children collected scrap metal, paper, and rubber for recycling drives. People turned in bacon grease to make explosives. Sacrifice became a badge of pride, a slogan spread across posters and radio broadcasts. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. The Depression had taught thrift. The war gave it purpose. A nation united by work. By 1943, unemployment was virtually zero. Wages increased. For the first time since 1929, families could save money again, though they had little to spend it on due to rationing. Factories were the heart of the new American dream. Every city pulsed with energy. In Detroit, sparks from welding torches lit up the night like fireworks. In Pittsburgh, the furnaces of the steel mills painted the sky orange. On the coasts, shipyards hummed like beehives. For workers who had endured a decade of hopelessness, the feeling of usefulness was intoxicating. Pride replaced despair. Paychecks replaced handouts. Purpose replaced fear. The human cost, behind the numbers. Yet beneath this miracle of production lay sorrow. Every neighborhood had families who hung blue stars in their windows, symbols of loved ones serving overseas. Gold stars marked the fallen. Mothers read telegrams through tears. Children memorized the names of places they could barely pronounce. Normandy, Tarawa, Anzio, because that's where their fathers were. The Depression had been a war against poverty. Now, the war was against tyranny. Both demanded sacrifice, but this time, the cost was measured in blood. Still, Americans endured. They believed this was a fight worth every ounce of effort, because this time, the enemy wasn't invisible markets, but visible evil. Science and innovation. The engines of change. Wartime necessity ignited innovation. The government poured billions into research. Universities and private companies worked side by side to create new technologies: radar, penicillin, synthetic materials, and the first digital computers. The Manhattan Project, cloaked in secrecy, developed the atomic bomb, a weapon that would end the war but open a new moral era. In less dramatic labs, quiet revolutions began. Better medicine, stronger metals, faster engines. The same drive that once built factories now built knowledge. The seeds of the post-war technological boom were planted here, in laboratories born from crisis, victory, and transformation. By 1945, the United States had produced 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 8,000 warships, billions of rounds of ammunition. No other nation had ever achieved such output. The war effort pulled the country not just out of depression, but into dominance. But prosperity did not erase pain. Over 400,000 Americans would not return home. The celebrations of victory were filled with joy and grief. Yet, as the guns fell silent, something remarkable happened. The nation did not collapse back into economic despair, as it had after the First World War. This time, the lessons of the 1930s were remembered, from war to peace. Instead of shrinking back into isolation, America leaned forward. Programs like the GI Bill offered returning soldiers college education, low-interest mortgages, and small business loans. Factories retooled again, not for tanks, but for cars, appliances, and homes. The pent-up consumer demand of the war years exploded. People who had once lived in Hoovervilles now dreamed of owning houses with lawns. Children who had grown up during the Depression were going to college. The United States emerged from the war with the world's strongest economy, producing half of all global goods by 1946. the global impact. While the U.S. flourished, much of the world lay in ruins. Europe's factories were bombed to rubble. Asia was shattered by occupation and conflict. America took the lead in reconstruction, launching the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe and promoting new international institutions to stabilize trade and finance. The war had forced the United States into leadership. The Depression had taught it the price of inaction. Together, those lessons shaped a new world order, one built, at least in theory, on cooperation rather than chaos. Reflections. What the war proved. The Second World War did what no policy, speech, or reform could do. It proved that coordinated effort, when powered by shared purpose, could lift an entire society. The Depression had revealed the dangers of fear and fragmentation. The war revealed the strength of unity, but it also left an uncomfortable truth. Prosperity had come through conflict. Could peace sustain it? That question would define the next generation and set the stage for everything that followed. The post-war world and the economic rebirth. The war ends, but the work begins. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled, but not in peace, in exhaustion. Cities across Europe lay in rubble. Millions were displaced. Economies had collapsed. Currencies had lost meaning, and the scars of war cut across every border. In America, the scene looked very different. Factories still thundered, fields still produced, banks still functioned. For the first time in modern history, one nation held the majority of the world's industrial capacity, and with it, the power to shape the post-war world. But peace brought its own questions. Could an economy built for destruction adapt to peacetime? Could workers stay employed when tanks and ships were no longer needed? Would the U.S. repeat the mistake of 1919, slashing spending, abandoning veterans, and sliding back into depression? The answers would define not just the next decade, but the next century. The GI Bill, Building Prosperity from Gratitude. In 1944, even before the war ended, President Roosevelt signed one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill. It offered millions of returning soldiers free college education, vocational training, low-interest home loans, and small business grants. It wasn't charity, it was investment. Over the next decade, more than 7 million veterans attended universities or trade schools on the GI Bill. They became engineers, doctors, teachers, and entrepreneurs. They founded companies, staffed laboratories, and built the technical backbone of the Cold War era. For the first time, higher education was no longer a privilege for the wealthy. It became the engine of the middle class. A single law turned war heroes into homeowners and scholars, changing the social DNA of the country. The baby boom and the suburban dream. As soldiers returned, families reunited and multiplied. Between 1946 and 1964, the United States experienced the baby boom, adding over 75 million children to its population. Entire neighborhoods sprang up almost overnight to house them. Developers like William Levitt perfected the model of mass-produced suburban homes, identical, affordable, efficient. Levittown, New York, became the blueprint for post-war suburbia. White picket fences, green lawns, cars in every driveway. The Depression generation, which had grown up fearing scarcity, now sought stability. They craved ownership, community, predictability. Their children would grow up surrounded by abundance their parents could scarcely imagine. Yet, beneath the shining surfaces, inequities persisted. Black veterans were often denied I-bill benefits through discriminatory lending and segregation. While some families moved into new suburbs, others remained confined to underfunded urban centers, a division that would shape American society for decades. Still, for millions, the suburbs symbolized something more than property. They were proof that the nightmare of the 1930s was truly over. The consumer revolution piece brought a new kind of boom, one driven by consumption rather than production for war. During the Depression and the war, Americans had learned to postpone desires. They repaired, reused, rationed. Now, with savings in the bank and factories retooled for civilian goods, they were ready to spend. Television sets, washing machines, refrigerators, and automobiles poured off assembly lines. Advertising evolved into an art form, selling not just products, but lifestyles. A refrigerator was no longer a convenience. It was a symbol of modern identity. A car wasn't transportation. It was freedom. In 1949, credit cards appeared in prototype form. By the mid-1950s, consumer credit became a cornerstone of the new economy. Banks encouraged borrowing. Manufacturers encouraged upgrades. The cycle of desire and debt became normalized. The Depression had made saving a virtue. The post-war age made spending one. The return of confidence and its shadow. The prosperity of the late 1940s and 1950s was dazzling, but fragile beneath the surface. Inflation threatened to rise as soldiers returned. Labor strikes erupted in steel, coal, and auto industries. Yet each challenge was met with compromise and growth, not collapse. America had learned the painful lessons of the 1930s. Government spending remained high. Veterans were supported. Markets were monitored. Banks were regulated. The scars of the Depression acted as invisible guardrails, preventing another plunge. But those scars also lived inside people. Parents who had gone hungry kept cellars stocked. Workers still feared layoffs with irrational dread. Children were told, money doesn't grow on trees. Not as cliché, but as survival wisdom. The prosperity of the 1950s was glittering on the outside, but haunted by memory. Every paycheck carried gratitude and anxiety that it could all vanish again. The Cold War economy. Global politics ensured that American industry never fully slowed. As tensions with the Soviet Union grew, military spending remained enormous, funding jet aircraft, nuclear submarines, and radar systems. This military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower later warned, became a permanent feature of the economy. Defense contracts kept factories humming. Research grants kept universities alive. The technologies of war fed the comforts of peace. Early computers, microwave ovens, synthetic fabrics, and the very rockets that would one day reach the moon. The Cold War was, in a paradoxical way, a continuation of wartime mobilization. A means of keeping the industrial gears turning without the devastation of battle, rebuilding the world, the Marshall Plan, and global leadership. Across the Atlantic, Europe faced famine and ruin. Recognizing that economic despair had once birthed fascism, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, a $13 billion aid program worth over $150 billion today. The plan rebuilt factories, railways, and power plants in 16 countries. It revived trade, stabilized currencies, and restored confidence in capitalism. For America, it wasn't only generosity, it was strategy. Rebuilding allies meant rebuilding markets. The same lessons learned from the Depression, that prosperity must be shared or it collapses, guided foreign policy. Institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and United Nations reflected this philosophy. Economic stability as a foundation for peace. By 1950, global trade had rebounded, powered by American industry and European reconstruction. The Great Depression's legacy was being rewritten into a story of resilience. Life at home, the culture of comfort. By the mid-1950s, the American home became the epicenter of the new prosperity. Television connected the country to a shared narrative of optimism. Families gathered to watch news, comedy, and the first live presidential debates. Suburban streets echoed with the laughter of children playing beneath power lines strung with the new miracle of electricity. Highways stretched across the nation, linking suburbs to cities, leisure to labor. Everything seemed possible. The Depression had taught restraint. The war had taught cooperation. Now, those lessons combined into an economy built on confidence and consumption. But this golden age was not universal. The same economic machine that created suburbia also left rural America and inner-city neighborhoods behind. The prosperity gap widened quietly, a reminder that even the brightest eras cast shadows. the psychological rebirth. Beyond statistics, the greatest transformation was internal. The generation that had grown up in the Depression carried lifelong humility. They valued work, community, and thrift, not as slogans, but as principles. They taught their children to save coins, to avoid waste, to respect the dignity of labor. Meanwhile, a younger generation, born into stability, grew up questioning the conformity that prosperity demanded. They wanted meaning beyond material comfort, a seed that would blossom into the social revolutions of the 1960s. Economic cycles create cultural cycles. The hardship of the 1930s produced resilience. The abundance of the 1950s produced restlessness. Both were responses to the same question: how should we live when fortune finally smiles again? From depression to dominance. By 1960, the numbers told a story once thought impossible. The U.S. economy accounted for more than 40% of global GDP. Unemployment hovered around 4%. Home ownership reached record highs. College enrollment tripled in a decade. The Great Depression had once symbolized the failure of capitalism. Now, America's post-war boom became proof of its revival. Economists and politicians around the world studied this transformation. How had a country so broken rebuilt itself so completely? The answer lay not in luck, but in learning, from mistakes, from suffering, and from the understanding that an economy is only as strong as the hope of its people. The world that followed. The prosperity of the post-war years created ripple effects everywhere. Japan, aided by American support, rebuilt into a manufacturing powerhouse. Germany's economy rebounded under the careful guidance of the Marshall Plan. Trade networks expanded, global institutions strengthened. The threat of another worldwide depression receded, at least for a time. But history never stands still. As the Cold War deepened and automation advanced, new tensions emerged: inequality, inflation, and cultural upheaval. Still, compared to the darkness of the 1930s, the mid-20th century was an age of astonishing renewal. The same generation that had once waited in breadlines now built highways, schools, and hospitals that would serve their grandchildren. Legacy of the rebirth. The post-war world wasn't perfect, but it was proof that recovery on a massive scale was possible. The lessons of the Great Depression had been etched into national policy. Regulate the financial system, support workers and veterans, invest in education and infrastructure, recognize that prosperity is not self-sustaining. It must be maintained with vigilance. These principles shaped not just economics, but identity. America saw itself as the guarantor of stability, the protector of freedom, and the architect of peace. That belief, born from depression and solidified through war, defined the rest of the century. Closing reflection, from dust to dawn. The story of post-war America is, at its core, a story of transformation, not from poverty to wealth, but from fear to confidence. The factories that once made weapons now made washing machines. The men who once fought across oceans now mowed lawns on Sunday mornings. The children who once went hungry now watched cartoons over breakfast. The Great Depression had taught the world that collapse was possible. The post-war boom taught that recovery was too. And between those two truths lay the enduring heartbeat of human history, our ability to adapt, rebuild, and hope again. The psychological and social aftershocks, the wounds beneath the prosperity. The Great Depression had ended, but its shadow still stretched across the nation. Even as the 1950s glittered with television sets, chrome cars, and new homes, something quiet and invisible lived beneath the surface, in memory. Those who had lived through the 1930s carried scars that didn't fade when their bank accounts filled. To understand the post-war world, we must first understand this truth. The Depression didn't just destroy wealth. It changed people, how they thought, how they loved, how they feared, how they lived. It reshaped character. The trauma of scarcity lingered in habits. The way people hoarded food, saved jars, reused tinfoil, or counted every penny before spending it. Psychologists later called it depression mentality. To those who had survived, it wasn't pathology, it was prudence. The family that survived. Together, families during the Depression learned to endure together, or not at all. They shared food, space, and work. Children contributed to household income. Grandparents moved in when savings disappeared. Family bonds were both tested and reinforced by hardship. After the war, those same bonds became the foundation of the suburban boom. Parents vowed their children would never go hungry, never feel that same uncertainty. They built households around comfort, safety, and predictability, the very things they'd been denied. The result was the rise of what sociologists later called the domestic ideal. The vision of the nuclear family, father at work, mother at home, children playing on clean lawns. It wasn't just culture, it was emotional recovery. After years of instability, Americans longed for control, and family life became the fortress of stability, thrift, and the gospel of saving. Even in an age of credit cards and easy loans, Depression survivors never stopped saving. They opened small savings accounts, bought war bonds, and filled attics with just-in-case supplies. They distrusted debt, not out of stubbornness, but out of memory. They'd seen banks collapse and credit vanish overnight. Money, they knew, could disappear like smoke. Children grew up hearing phrases like, "Don't waste food," "Pay cash or don't buy it," and "A penny saved is a penny earned." These weren't slogans, they were commandments carved by experience. This national obsession with saving helped stabilize the post-war economy. It provided banks with deposits, capital for growth, and a buffer against downturns. The generation that had once stood in breadlines unknowingly laid the foundation for modern American finance, the psychology of fear and control. But survival had a cost. Many Depression survivors developed what psychologists would later describe as chronic anxiety, a deep-seated fear that the good times couldn't last. They checked their savings accounts compulsively. They distrusted politicians who promised too much. They avoided risk. This mindset influenced everything from parenting to policy. Parents taught caution. Don't quit a steady job. Don't gamble with money. Don't talk about politics at work. Schools emphasized discipline and obedience. Governments adopted safeguards, unemployment insurance, Social Security, minimum wage, all built from the same psychological need: to never repeat 1929. Even prosperity became something to fear, because people knew how quickly it could vanish. The political legacy, faith in the state. Before the Great Depression, the government was a distant presence in most lives. After it, the government became a safety net, a partner, and in times of crisis, a savior. The New Deal had changed expectations forever. Citizens no longer viewed government intervention as a last resort, but as a moral duty. The social contract had been rewritten. During the post-war boom, these expectations grew stronger. Farmers relied on subsidies. Veterans relied on the GI Bill. Families relied on federally backed mortgages. Every layer of prosperity rested, at least in part, on the lessons of the 1930s. The Depression taught that markets alone could not guarantee security. The people demanded balance, capitalism with compassion, growth with guardrails. That belief guided policy for decades. Cultural echoes, art, music, and memory. The Depression left fingerprints on American culture long after it ended. Writers like John Steinbeck, photographers like Dorothea Lange, and artists like Grant Wood had captured its suffering in timeless form. Their work became touchstones for later generations, seeking to understand hardship and hope. In the post-war years, film and television reinterpreted those themes. Movies like It's a Wonderful Life reminded viewers of community, generosity, and moral courage, values born in the 1930s. Country and folk music preserved the voice of the working class. Even early rock and roll carried the echoes of Depression-era blues, rhythms of resilience and rebellion. The cultural memory of hardship never fully disappeared. It evolved, retelling the story in every new medium. Generational divide, the children of fear, the youth of freedom. By the 1960s, the children of the Depression had raised a generation that knew only abundance. They had grown up with security, education, and opportunity, things their parents had once dreamed of. But with comfort came restlessness. The youth of the 1960s rebelled against the cautious conservatism of their parents. They saw thrift as stinginess, order as conformity, and stability as stagnation. They wanted meaning beyond material success. Ironically, this rebellion was itself a product of prosperity, a freedom made possible by the very stability their parents had fought to create. The same fear that built suburbia also sparked its rejection. History had turned full circle. The generation forged by fear had raised one unafraid to question everything: social class and inequality. The Great Depression had once seemed like an equalizer. Rich and poor both lost fortunes. But recovery revealed a different story. White middle-class families advanced through education and home ownership. Minorities, blocked by discrimination and redlining, often remained trapped in economic limbo. The benefits of the New Deal and GI Bill were not distributed evenly. This inequity seeded future struggles: the civil rights movement, urban unrest, and debates over poverty that dominated the 1960s and beyond. The Depression's promise of shared security had been only partially fulfilled. The shadow of debt and desire. By the 1970s, a new contradiction emerged. The children of savers became spenders. The same nation that once feared borrowing now built its prosperity on credit. Department stores offered financing. Banks mailed credit cards to anyone with an address. Homes, cars, college. Everything could be purchased now and paid for later. For the first time, Americans measured success not by what they saved, but by what they owned. The ghosts of the Great Depression stirred uneasily. Economists warned of bubbles, of imbalance, of forgetting the lessons learned in hardship. But prosperity had a way of dulling memory. History's most enduring trap is comfort, the belief that what once fell apart never could again. The survivors grow old. By the late 20th century, the Depression generation was aging. Their stories became family folklore: the soup lines, the dust storms, the nights spent worrying about eviction. Grandparents told grandchildren, "We had nothing, and we made it." They taught gratitude for small things: a full fridge, a steady job, a light that stayed on. They measured success not in luxury, but in security. To younger ears, their warnings sounded outdated. But those who listened understood. Behind every modern comfort stood generations who had clawed their way back from ruin. Echoes in modern crisis. Each new downturn rekindled memories of the old one. When the oil crisis hit in the 1970s, journalists drew comparisons to 1933. When the 2008 financial collapse struck, millions of Americans once again asked the same questions their ancestors had. How could this happen? Why weren't we prepared? The answers were eerily familiar: speculation, deregulation, overconfidence. The Great Depression was not just a historical event. It was a mirror. Every crisis since reflects its shape, its warnings, its consequences. Psychological inheritance, the DNA of caution. Even generations born long after the Depression carry fragments of its psychology. It lives in our collective habits, in emergency funds, in social safety nets, in distrust of economic elites. It shapes the way people vote, save, and dream. It's why recessions still feel like moral failures, why unemployment evokes shame, why markets are treated with both awe and suspicion. The Depression taught humanity that prosperity is not a right, it's a responsibility. The Great Depression as memory and myth. With time, the Great Depression became both history and legend, a story told to remind, to warn, and to teach. For those who lived it, it was reality: hunger, fear, and endurance. For those who inherited it, it became parable, a story about excess, humility, and resilience. Every generation interprets it anew. Some see it as proof of government's necessity, others as a warning against dependence. But beneath the politics lies a universal lesson: that civilization's strength lies not in its wealth, but in its ability to recover when wealth disappears. Closing reflection: the weight of memory. The Great Depression's psychological shadow is not one of misery, but of mindfulness. It reminds us how fragile stability is, and how deeply we depend on one another when it falters. Those who endured it didn't merely survive, they changed the world by remembering. Global lessons and modern parallels. The world that watched America fall. When the U.S. stock market collapsed in 1929, the shockwaves rippled across the planet. It was the first truly global economic collapse, and it changed how nations understood money, trade, and power. At the time, America was the world's largest creditor, lending billions to rebuild Europe after World War I. When American banks failed, that credit vanished. Factories in Britain went silent. Farmers in Canada and Australia saw crop prices collapse. German banks crumbled, deepening political chaos that would pave the way for Hitler's rise. The Great Depression wasn't an American story. It was a human one. And when the U.S. finally recovered, the world took notes. Lesson 1. Interconnection and contagion. The Depression revealed that in a global economy, isolation is an illusion. No country could wall itself off from financial panic. Tariffs, currency controls, and protectionism only deepened the pain. When the U.S. passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, other nations retaliated. Global trade fell by 2/3 within 3 years. Farmers, miners, and manufacturers everywhere paid the price. It was an early warning of something we understand instinctively today. Economies are like ecosystems. When one part fails, the damage spreads. This insight became the cornerstone of post-war cooperation, the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later the World Trade Organization. They were built to keep money flowing, trade open, and crises contained. The world had learned the hard way that economic nationalism can turn recession into ruin. Lesson 2. Regulation and responsibility. Before the Great Depression, the stock market was a frontier. Wild, unregulated, driven by speculation and rumor. Banks gambled with customer deposits. Insider trading was common practice. Accountability was almost non-existent. The crash of 1929 shattered public trust so completely that reform became inevitable. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 separated commercial and investment banking. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, was established to police markets, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, guaranteed savings up to a certain amount, ending the era of panicked bank runs. These reforms restored faith in the system. But they also introduced a new philosophy. Markets need referees. Unchecked optimism had nearly destroyed capitalism itself. After 1929, regulation became the price of stability. That idea shaped financial systems across the world, from Canada's prudently regulated banks to the social market models of Western Europe. It became a global consensus. Economic freedom requires discipline. Lesson 3. The role of government. The Depression demolished the 19th century belief that markets could correct themselves without intervention. In its wake, a new economic theory emerged, Keynesian economics, named after British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that during crises, governments must spend, even if it means running deficits, to restart demand and confidence. His ideas inspired Roosevelt's New Deal and influenced policies worldwide. They also became the playbook for post-war recovery. When recessions hit in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, nations no longer waited for the invisible hand to fix things. They acted. They built infrastructure, subsidized industries, and protected workers. Even today, every stimulus package, every central bank interest rate cut, and every social safety net traces its roots to that revelation from the 1930s. Sometimes, doing nothing is the most expensive choice. Lesson 4. The danger of inequality. Long before the crash, wealth in the 1920s had become dangerously concentrated. Top earners amassed fortunes through speculation, while ordinary workers stagnated. The bubble was built on imbalance, and when it burst, the poor had no cushion, and the middle class vanished overnight. This pattern repeated in later crises, from the oil shocks of the 1970s to the housing crash of 2008. Each time, inequality amplified the damage. The Depression taught economists that when wealth pools at the top, economies become brittle. Consumption falters, investment dries up, and resentment grows. It's not just an economic issue. It's political. In the 1930s, despair gave rise to extremism. Fascism fed on unemployment. Authoritarianism promised order. The same warning echoes in every modern era of unrest. Inequality, left unchecked, is not merely unfair, it's unstable. Lesson 5: The power of hope and communication. When Roosevelt spoke to the nation through his fireside chats, he didn't just deliver policy, he delivered calm. People who had lost everything listened to his voice crackle through their radios, and for the first time in years, believed again that recovery was possible. Confidence, economists realized, was not just emotion, it was infrastructure. Markets run on trust, societies function on belief. In the years since, every effective leader during crisis, from Churchill to Kennedy to Obama, has drawn on that same principle, that reassurance can be as powerful as stimulus. The Depression taught us that recovery begins not with money, but with mindset. The global ripple, Europe, Asia, and beyond. The Great Depression's legacy didn't stop at America's borders. In Europe, it accelerated the fall of democracy in nations unprepared for economic catastrophe. Germany's collapse fueled the rise of Hitler. Italy turned to Mussolini. Spain descended into civil war. By the time the U.S. recovered, the world was on fire. In Latin America, collapsing export prices led to coups and dictatorships. In Asia, Japan turned inward, seeking imperial expansion as an answer to economic isolation. In Australia, unemployment reached nearly 30%, forcing the government to rewrite its entire fiscal policy. No continent escaped unscarred, but those wounds also forced innovation. Social welfare systems in Britain and Scandinavia, public banking in Canada, and industrial reforms in Japan all emerged from the ashes of 1930s chaos. The Depression was humanity's economic crucible, and out of it came the foundations of the modern world. History repeats. The crisis of 2008, nearly 80 years later, in 2008, the world once again faced collapse. A housing bubble inflated by easy credit and risky speculation burst, toppling banks and freezing global finance. The headlines were hauntingly familiar. Stock market panic, mass layoffs, government bailouts. And yet, something remarkable happened. The collapse didn't become another Great Depression. Why? Because the world remembered. Central banks cut rates immediately. Governments injected stimulus into economies. Unemployment insurance and social programs softened the blow. Leaders coordinated across borders. Actions that were unthinkable in 1929. The 2008 crash was devastating, but it was contained. Proof that the lessons of the Great Depression had not been forgotten. The systems built in the 1930s, regulation, safety nets, global cooperation, had done their job. History rhymes. The pandemic of 2020. Then, in 2020, history tested those lessons again. A virus brought the global economy to a standstill. Factories closed, travel halted, entire industries froze overnight. The shock was immediate, total, and global. Once again, governments turned to Keynesian playbooks, massive public spending, emergency relief, central bank intervention. In months, trillions of dollars were mobilized. And though the pain was severe, the collapse many feared, a depression-level event, never fully arrived. This wasn't luck. It was the long echo of 1929, the world, decades later, still guided by the lessons learned in crisis. The digital age and the new fragility. But the 21st century has brought new vulnerabilities. Today, markets move at the speed of algorithms. Social media can trigger financial panic faster than any bank run of the 1930s. Cryptocurrency, automation, and globalized labor create wealth at lightning speed and erase it just as fast. For all our progress, the same old fears remain beneath the surface. What happens when trust breaks, when inequality widens, when optimism fades? We are richer, faster, and more connected than any generation before. And yet, the same forces that destroyed the world in 1929 still flicker within our systems. The difference now is awareness. We know how fragile prosperity is because we've seen it collapse. The modern mindset, between fear and faith. Economically, the Depression ended long ago. Psychologically, it never truly did. Its caution still lives in the collective consciousness, shaping everything from monetary policy to personal finance. Every time a central bank hesitates to raise rates, every time a government debates stimulus, the ghosts of 1930s economists whisper in the background. Even in households, the echo continues, parents teaching children to save for a rainy day, investors diversifying portfolios, communities stocking up for uncertainty. The Great Depression taught the world not only how to rebuild, but how to remember. The moral of the century. When we look back at the Great Depression today, we see more than graphs and statistics. We see the moment humanity grew up. We learned humility in prosperity, empathy in crisis, and discipline in recovery. We learned that unchecked greed is not innovation, that markets without morality become monsters, and that freedom requires fairness. Those lessons became the scaffolding of the modern world. Every welfare system, every regulatory agency, every policy debate about inflation, debt, or inequality, all trace their roots to those desperate years between 1929 and 1939. The Great Depression wasn't the end of capitalism, it was its education. Looking forward, the next test. New challenges loom on the horizon: automation, climate change, artificial intelligence, and geopolitical tension. Each carries the potential to disrupt economies as deeply as 1929 did. The question is not whether another collapse will come. History guarantees it will in some form. The question is whether we will recognize it soon enough to act. The world today has tools. The 1930s did not. Instant communication, global cooperation, and decades of hard-earned wisdom. But it also has new risks: speed, complexity, and fragility, on scales the past never knew. The greatest legacy of the Great Depression is not the memory of collapse, but the capacity to respond. Closing reflection. Humanity's greatest lesson. The Great Depression stands as a monument, not to failure, but to transformation. It showed us the danger of arrogance, the necessity of compassion, and the indestructible power of human endurance. It proved that no collapse is permanent if people refuse to surrender. When markets crash, when jobs vanish, when headlines warn of doom, the voice of that era still whispers, "We have been here before. We learned, we endured, we rose again." That is the true inheritance of the Great Depression: not fear, but resilience; not despair, but wisdom. And as long as we remember, no crisis, no matter how vast, can ever truly defeat us. The human legacy, a century later. Nearly a century has passed since the Great Depression began. The stock tickers have gone silent, the breadlines have faded into photographs, and the people who lived those years have mostly left us. But their story is still here, in the quiet spaces between our everyday comforts, in the choices we make without realizing why, in the fears we rarely name aloud. The Great Depression is not just history, it is heritage, written not in textbooks, but in our instincts. It taught the world how easily prosperity can vanish, and how deeply resilience can root itself in the human heart. Its shadow stretches behind every economic boom, every policy debate, every cautious glance at the future. It reminds us that security is not permanent, that greed has limits, and that hope, though fragile, is indestructible. The generation that rebuilt the world, the people who endured the Great Depression, were ordinary men and women: shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, mechanics, mothers, and children. They had no guidebook for what they faced. They woke up one morning to find the rules of the world rewritten, savings gone, jobs vanished, futures erased. Yet they endured. They rationed, repaired, recycled, and reinvented. They turned adversity into ingenuity, growing gardens in city lots, sewing clothes from flour sacks, creating community kitchens, and sharing what little they had. When war came, they carried that same discipline into the factories, the fields, and the battlefronts. When peace returned, they used it to build a new world, one of suburbs, schools, highways, and hospitals. Their endurance became the architecture of the modern age. They proved that survival is not enough, that rebuilding is a moral act. The quiet heroes. Most of their names are lost to time. No monuments list the mothers who stretched soup for 7 mouths, or the fathers who walked miles each morning looking for work that wasn't there. No textbooks honor the children who learned to hide their hunger behind polite smiles. But they are the reason the modern world exists. Every freeway, every power plant, every public library, every social safety net carries their invisible fingerprints. They taught us that societies are not measured by how they prosper, but by how they endure hardship. They were not a generation of wealth. They were a generation of worth. The psychology of a scar. Even decades after recovery, the Depression never truly ended inside the people who lived it. A woman born in 1915 once told her granddaughter, "I never throw away food. I remember what it's like to be hungry." A retired steelworker confessed that he still hid cash in coffee cans because banks aren't forever. A grandmother, long after she owned a home and car, still saved bits of string, just in case. These habits might seem small, even odd, but they were the language of survival, unspoken lessons carved into daily life. They were living proof that trauma doesn't vanish with prosperity. It transforms into caution, gratitude, and empathy. The inheritance of resilience. Their children and grandchildren inherited more than a stable economy. They inherited values forged in scarcity: discipline, patience, humility, community. The idea that life is unpredictable, but people can endure anything when they stand together. Even as technology changed, even as prosperity expanded, that quiet moral DNA remained. When factories closed in the 1970s, or when recession struck in the 1980s, it was their wisdom. Save what you can, help who you can, that guided millions through uncertainty. The Great Depression's greatest legacy wasn't the New Deal, or Social Security, or any government program. It was the endurance it left in the human spirit, the stubborn refusal to surrender. The world they left us. Look around today. The highways that connect our cities, the universities that train our children, the regulations that keep banks accountable, the international systems that maintain trade and peace. All of these are descendants of the lessons learned in that bleak decade. The world rebuilt after the Great Depression was not just more prosperous, it was wiser. It had seen what happens when greed outpaces compassion, when profit eclipses humanity, when the strong forget the weak. And so, it built guardrails, imperfect but vital, to keep civilization steady. Those guardrails still stand. They are invisible when times are good, but priceless when times turn dark, when memory fades. But time erodes memory. Each generation grows further from the hunger, the uncertainty, the silence of empty factories and foreclosed farms. The lessons of hardship are hardest to remember in times of abundance. When markets soar and credit flows freely, caution begins to look old-fashioned. People forget why regulations exist. Governments cut safety nets, convinced they're no longer needed. Confidence swells into arrogance, and the cycle turns again. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but it rhymes, always to the same melody. Hubris before collapse, humility after. And every time we forget the Great Depression, we edge closer to rediscovering it. What it means to remember. Remembering the Great Depression isn't about nostalgia, it's about gratitude. It's about understanding that everything we call normal was once a dream, that the lights above us, the roofs over us, the jobs we hold, the food we waste, these are victories built on the bones of struggle. Every paycheck, every grocery store aisle, every moment of stability is a quiet monument to those who came before. They earned these comforts for us, not by fortune, but by endurance. To forget them would be to forget the cost of civilization itself. The moral lesson. The Depression's lesson is not simply economic, it is ethical. It reminds us that wealth without compassion breeds collapse, that progress without conscience breeds instability, and that the health of an economy depends on the humanity within it. In the 1920s, prosperity had made people careless. In the 1930s, suffering made them wise. In the decades that followed, that wisdom built systems meant to protect both heart and home. But those systems require constant vigilance, for greed never sleeps, and memory fades easily when bellies are full. To honor the Great Depression's legacy is not to dwell in fear, but to live in awareness. Echoes. Across the world around the globe, every nation carries its own version of the story. In Germany, memories of 1931 still shape caution in banking. In Britain, the welfare state remains a moral commitment born of the interwar years. In Japan, the discipline of post-war reconstruction grew from Depression-era austerity. In the United States, the shadow of 1929 still hovers over every economic decision, from Wall Street to the Federal Reserve. The Great Depression was the world's shared teacher, a decade of pain that became a century of wisdom. Its lessons were written in loss, but preserved in progress. The fragility of prosperity. Today our world hums with the illusion of permanence. Digital markets trade trillions in seconds. Algorithms manage wealth invisible to the human eye. But beneath the glass towers and glowing screens lies the same truth that haunted 1930. Confidence is fragile. Trust is fragile. Civilization itself is fragile. And yet, so is glass, until it is tempered by fire. The Great Depression was that fire. It hardened humanity's understanding of itself. It taught us how to fall, how to break, and how to rise. The eternal pattern: fall, rise, remember. Every generation faces its own trial, a war, a recession, a pandemic, a reckoning. Each believes its crisis is unique until it listens closely to the echoes of the past. The Great Depression speaks across time, not as a ghost, but as a guide. It whispers through the data of economists, through the policies of governments, through the whispered fears of families. It says, be careful, be kind, be ready. Because collapse will always come, but so will recovery. That is the rhythm of history. Fall, rise, remember. From numbers to names. The Great Depression is often told in statistics: unemployment rates, GDP loss, billions vanished. But history is not numbers. It's names, faces, hands, choices. It's the coal miner in West Virginia who walked home with empty pockets, the mother in Oklahoma who fed her children dust and prayer, the shopkeeper in Chicago who gave bread on credit knowing he'd never be repaid, the banker who carried his failure like a wound, the teacher who stayed in a one-room school so her students wouldn't lose hope. They were not heroes in storybooks. They were heroes in silence. The kind history rarely honors, but humanity never forgets. The gift of memory. When we study the Great Depression, we are not studying economics. We are studying character. We are studying what happens when everything breaks and people refuse to. It's easy to admire strength when it wins. It's harder to recognize it when it simply endures. Those who lived through the Great Depression didn't change the world through brilliance or luck. They changed it through persistence. One repaired shoe, one shared meal, one more day of trying. Their greatest gift to us is not prosperity, but perspective. What they would tell us now, if they could speak to us today, across the gulf of time, through the noise of our modern world. What would they say? They might tell us to cherish what we have, to measure success not in things, but in relationships, to remember that community is wealth and empathy is insurance. They might warn us that progress without compassion leads back to ruin, that an economy is not healthy if it leaves its people hungry, that innovation without ethics repeats the mistakes of 1929, only faster. And they might remind us gently that hardship is not the enemy of hope, it is its birthplace. The final lesson. The Great Depression began as a story of loss, of wealth, of confidence, of control, but it ends as a story of rediscovery, of courage, of humanity, of balance. It taught us that when the foundations of the world crumble, the true currency of civilization is not gold, or stocks, or land, it's faith. Faith in each other, faith in resilience, faith in the simple truth that no darkness is absolute. The Great Depression began with fear. It ended with wisdom, and that wisdom remains the greatest inheritance we have. Closing narration. The Great Depression is not over. Not because we still suffer, but because we still remember. It lives in every safeguard, every paycheck, every act of compassion born from the memory of struggle. It is the quiet teacher behind our ambition, whispering, "Build wisely, for the ground can always give way." So we tell its story, not to mourn, but to honor, not to fear collapse, but to celebrate resilience, not to dwell on despair, but to recognize the miracle of recovery. Because from dust and despair rose resilience and reform. From silence and hunger came unity and purpose. And from the darkest decade in modern history came the light of understanding, that progress is fragile, but people are not.